Hi, everyone, to all those tuning in to my YouTube station here. Smita Sharma, journalist. Hello and a warm welcome. The winters, in fact, are now going away, but the political climate from Delhi to its regional partners and neighbors seems to be absolutely heated up. And I'm joined in this conversation by Constantino Xavier. He is in fact, a fellow with the Center for Social and Economic Progress, formerly known as Brookings India. Because what we are going to talk about is the situation in Myanmar, where this early morning we got news that was streamed in that Aung San Suu Kyi had been arrested along with some other top political leaders, and the military then announced that it has taken over the country and it has declared an emergency for 1 year as of now. Now, this is not the first time really that Myanmar is going to be under the junta or the military, but from 2011 onwards, we've just had, in fact, two civilian elections that were conducted. In fact, the last one was in November last year, and that's where we saw Aung San Suu Kyi's, in fact, NLD, win seats very easily. The available seats in parliament, which also actually has 25% quota for the military. So to understand what's really playing out in these dynamics, Constantino, social media was abuzz with all these speculations over the past few weeks. So it didn't really come as a surprise. I think people were reading into the situation, as they say, reading the tea leaves there in Myanmar.
Sorry, thanks, Smita, for having me. What is a surprise is a bit relative. Some things seem more surprising than others, but certainly there were tensions between the military and the civilian leadership brewing over the last few years. As you rightly said, this marks the end, really, of 10 years of an experiment with democratic opening and institutions. As you rightly pointed out, that came after 50 years of almost continuous authoritarian rule with more or less military control. So this is really a setback for one of India's democratic neighbors.
Suhasini Heather of The Hindu had an interesting point to make earlier today, where she said that you cannot perhaps call it a coup because you didn't really have a proper functional democracy, many would argue, in Myanmar. It's more to do maybe with a military reassertion of power. Explain to the people watching this conversation, Constantino, as to why really would the military feel threatened at this point in time?
So to the question of the naming, is this a coup or not? I think we're using a really an old term that will not be leading to visuals of tanks and massive changes, but I think the degrees of emergencies, degrees of authoritarian control that we are seeing not only in Myanmar but across the region. And a consolidation of power by autocrats, by a limited number of people. So that's the same thing happening in Myanmar. It was never a perfect democracy, far from it. In fact, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, as the state councillor herself, had flirted with authoritarian tendencies and new majoritarianism. But I think to put this in perspective to your second part of your question of why the military took this action now, is the military was always reluctant about opening. That is not surprising after 50 years of power. So post 2011, it developed, it endorsed a constitution that had important clauses that gave the army a monopoly of power, really, a veto over constitutional changes. So that also explains why someone that was lauded as a great Democrat, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, was very limited in her ability to engineer the peace process with the insurgent groups, of actually bringing democracy to the country and opening it up. So it's been a very timid transition. And I think the military here perceived clearly that it was losing control. And generally, after the elections of November last year, which you rightly pointed out, gave a tremendous, in fact, historic majority to the National League for Democracy, the military felt more threatened than ever that it was losing control.
And I mean, not just feeling threatened about it, but it's kind of become ironical that from US to Myanmar now, these constant claims of election fraud happening during the polls, even in the November elections, really, Constantino. When the military says that there was an election fraud, how should one take it?
I mean, that is technicalities that we can discuss on and on. I think no one really knows, even in Myanmar, etc. Not, but certainly you don't need a lot of excuses to take over power these days around the world, like you rightly point out, Smith. I think anything is a good excuse. And what is changing de facto is that you had the balance of power has gravitated as of last night in Myanmar, and that is clear. That is clear, and that is the realistic understanding what has happened in power. There were warnings before. I think people tend to uh, I think underestimate the degree of pressure that can come from countries abroad on the Myanmar military, in particularly. And in fact, there have been, after the Rohingya crisis, renewed emphasis on sanctions, on pressure, on the top brass of the Myanmar armed forces, which may have further created that sense of insecurity within the army and led it to take this decision now and preempt any further action. Let's not forget that we have a new administration in the United States of America that is
Yes.
certainly going to be looking at values, human rights, democracy with greater appetite than President Trump. So I think there again you have another reason, if you want to add to the many reasons that may have led to this action last night.
Yes, but even as you mentioned about Donald Trump, and we will talk about the what's at stake really for India and US in the region also briefly moving forward. But let me also read out, in fact, we did see reactions coming from Annette Price, the White House spokesperson as well, who said that President Joe Biden, the US is alarmed by reports that the Burmese military has taken steps to undermine the country's democratic transition, including the arrest of State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi and other civilian officials in Burma. President Biden has been briefed by the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and we continue to affirm our strong support for Burma's democratic institutions. So it's a longer statement. We have also seen statement, in fact, being put out by the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi, which did look a very measured response, where they said that we have noted the developments in Myanmar with deep concern. India has always been steadfast in its support to the process of democratic transition in Myanmar, and we believe that the rule of law and the democratic process must be upheld. We are monitoring the situation. What's at stake really for India here, knowing very well, Constantino, that even in the past, when it was under the military rule and the US pressed with sanctions, there were Western economic sanctions, India always took a position that we have to deal with Myanmar regardless because we share borders with them. So is there going to be really a different response this time around?
In fact, I would add that India's policy of engaging is not that different than the American was. I mean, the Americans often, of course, slapped sanctions, pushed Myanmar much harder and in public, but continue to do also a lot of business with Myanmar, including the 1990s, 2000s. The Japanese did, the Chinese did, the Southeast Asians did. So let's also put the Europeans, by the way, right, on a lot of this. So there was a lot of double speak also, of course, from these countries. But coming to the Indian response first, you mentioned measured. It is measured, it's balanced, but it is not easy for India to speak that language. It's a very strong language. It condemns what happened, I think quite clearly between the lines, and it openly says democratic process, detentions, rule of law, right? It speaks about what really happened, and that is, I think, something that needs to be appreciated because it will come with a political cost, right? The top military leadership is looking at reactions and will take positions respective to those reactions. India's reaction in the statement, at least, has been quite clear, right? Unlike even previous reactions to other changes in Myanmar, where India has sort of come out with, I think, lesser emphatic reactions on democracy. So that's one. But as you rightly point out again, leading me to my first point, all countries will try to hedge their options and keep the avenues open towards Myanmar. That is a change from the 1990s. So we see China saying nothing, right? And watching and sort of engaging easy, right? They don't have the pressures India has in other countries. The Southeast Asians, of course, the Thai military regime has come out in open support. The Singaporeans have reflected some concerns. The Americans, as you mentioned, have come out quite strong. The Europeans too, the European Union. But in the end, no one can afford to sideline Myanmar, and everyone knows that the power has shifted towards the military. So there will be a varying degree of engagement with that new reality, mostly because I think most countries, including the US, I may say here, has realized that India's policy of engagement is the only policy to deal with Myanmar, because otherwise you will be continuously pushing that country towards isolationism and certainly into Chinese hands more than ever.
Right. I mean, even countries like Australia have, of course, both called for the release of the detention of the NLD leaders because, along with the state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, remember, President Win Mint was also arrested early this morning. Some noted, in fact, filmmakers and critics have also been rounded up in the morning hours, just hours before the parliament was actually set to resume for the first time since those elections in November of last year. But, for the coming to the United States, Constantino, we saw what played out all throughout November, December following the election results and the kind of damage that Trump managed to do to that American shine, the shining city on the hill, in terms of that making a mockery of the democratic transition process. So when will Joe Biden find himself on a weaker position right now, because possibly the army will say pot calling kettle black.
Not so much, I think, because of the internal reputation of the US. You're right, it took a hit in the public perception during the Trump administration. But I think under a Biden administration now, we will see a US that will become much more interventionist again. But the context is different from the 1990s or 2000s, right? The context is one where the US cannot afford as much as it did, at least in the past, to cut off Myanmar, put up pressure, etc. That's where the US and the Europeans also have become more sensitive to the Indian arguments, to engage, nudge the Myanmar military to maybe reduce the state of emergency, hold elections earlier than sooner. Not very different from what you see in India's position towards Nepal, India's position towards Sri Lanka, India's position towards Bangladesh, where there are also many concerns, right, about the health of the democratic institutions and process. But at the same time, on the Indian side, you see also an adjustment compared to 10, 20 years ago, right? That's why I think that statement is so interesting. It is an open statement about democracy, about the rule of law, and about concern about the internal affairs of a neighboring country. And that is being signaled quite clearly to Myanmar. It may come again at a cost, as I mentioned, right? Because the generals are looking at what is happening and will take exception probably at India. But, one thing is what you say in public, the other thing is what you do in private. And I'm sure that also through the diplomatic and security and military channels of India, there will be continuous engagement with Myanmar to keep India's core interests in mind. And those core interests are the insurgency in the northeast. Those core interests are Myanmar being too close to China. And those interests are also making Myanmar into more of a connectivity hub between South and Southeast Asia.
But will some of the calls from DC to Myanmar perhaps be routed in a way through Delhi? I mean, will US be looking at India and playing some sort of a role here?
No, I don't think that that single track is there in terms of India, US towards the neighbors, right? There's a lot of talk that India's policy is a subset of American policy in Nepal and Sri Lanka, or vice versa, that the American policy is a subset of India's policy. I don't think that these countries outsource their policies that easily towards each other. There's certainly convergence. But what will happen, Smita, more, and has been happening, in fact, is coordination, exchanging assessments, right? And that started in the 2000s in Myanmar, that India and the US started talking about what's happening there, educating each other to their respective core interests, understanding the sensitivities. That is not happening between India and China, right? You don't see India and China exchanging assessments about Myanmar and having a degree of confidence and trust in terms of seeing what's happening in this neighborhood. But you see it happening between India and the US, India and the Europeans more, India and the Southeast Asians also.
Give us a little more, in fact, sort of understanding, Constantino, about the China factor right now, because we've seen the kind of roads, the infrastructure that has been built with Chinese money and Chinese aid. Also the kind of Chinese influence that is always talked about. You said that China is watching the situation, maybe taking a step back at the moment, but really the acting president who steps in, the military's equation with China, sheds some more light on it.
No, I think just bring in the democracy and China argument together. We spoke about democracy, values, etc. It's not just out of the blue. It doesn't matter just as a luxury. India doesn't want to see democratic Myanmar because it's nicer and closer and because Daw Aung Suu Kyi studied in India and is a friend of India. I mean, those things don't really matter. What matters in India, this has been a continuous line in India's Myanmar policy, is that to solve the country's domestic insurgency and conflict, we talk about the Nagas, the Kachins, right? So a lot of insurgent armed groups that are on India's border that have harbored Indian militants and insurgents until today, an important Naga faction, for example, of the NSCN, right? All of that, India always understood that it can only be solved with more democracy, more inclusion, right? To bring those groups and these minorities into the Myanmar constitution. That's number one. That is something that China does not share. China is much more comfortable in dealing with anyone, whoever in power, right? And I think here we've seen a greater maneuvering ground by the Chinese that have been able to flexibly adapt their policy in Myanmar and deal with either democratic forces or the military forces. But interestingly, it's the exact opposite of India's approach. The Chinese government is, through its People's Liberation Army, always been more interested in a army or a military rule in Myanmar. It feels more comfortable. In fact, those are the reactions we're seeing over the last few hours, where China is basically saying, we have our pros and cons, and Dong She actually played the important role of reaching out to China, but the army and the military is really the ultimate guardian of Myanmar's interests. And for China to say something like that tells you clearly what China feels. And it also tells you that India not saying that is not comfortable, not as comfortable as China with an authoritarian military regime in Myanmar.
Okay, which brings me just to my last couple of questions, Constantino. I mean, on the issue of the Aung San Suu Kyi herself, Nobel laureate, a former icon who somehow, of course, was hugely criticized by, people across the world for developing the feet of clay on the issue of Rohingyas, the exodus that happened in 2017, the killings. But she still continues to be very, very popular, something I think which the election results also show amongst the majority Buddhist population. So, are you worried about her arrest at this point in time? She's somebody who has been in detention for more than 2 decades in the past before she took that active political plunge fighting elections. But are you worried about her personal safety at this point?
See, the narrative in the West in particular, in the international community also, and including in India sometimes, has been that she somehow became an authoritarian, that she closed her eyes to what was happening in the Rakhine state with the Rohingya refugees, that she's embraced Burman, Bamar nationalism, ethno-nationalism. She's played around with Buddhist chauvinism. Now, my question here is, she paid a price for all that yesterday night. Imagine if she had done more for democracy and be more independent, more liberal in the past 10 years. This coup would have happened even earlier, right? So you can see under what constraints she had to operate over the last 10 years. Tremendous constraints, under continuous in a balance of nationalism, political nationalism, religion, the military and its control. So, I think what we see here is unfortunately the end of that experiment for the time being. But at the same time, also, it shows to you how difficult these democratic transitions are and how patient you have to be. And how long time they take. This has been 10 years. And if she's paying a price after 10 years of very timid reforms for which she's been denounced even in the impatient democratic West, you can imagine how long it will take for this proper democratic transition to happen in Myanmar. And I think, to be frank, that is the thinking which goes on in Delhi, and that is the recognition that you have in Delhi, that to expect too much from her, from any Democrat in Myanmar, is unreasonable. As it is unreasonable now to expect that the Myanmar military will somehow leave power sooner rather than later and get used to returning to the barracks. This will take a long time, a lot of patience, and a lot of maneuvering from India's policy also to engage with Myanmar, make sure that the state of Myanmar, whoever's in control, respects India's core interests, but at the same time also keep that hope open that the country will become more democratic, more inclusive, and therefore more stable and more wealthy.
You do not share the sentiments of the critics who argue that Aung San Suu Kyi was in a race to outdo the military itself on issues of nationalism. You feel that
she was,
the situation did not allow her for.
She was, and that's exactly my point. She was in some ways. She had to, when you operate in politics under those constraints, that's what you have to do. And she paid a price for that. I mean, if she paid a price for that limited competitive nationalism, imagine she had been less nationalist. That is exactly my point. This tells you about the fragility of the context she was operating in. and some victories she had achieved. I mean, you have to be very pragmatic to operate in that country. And whoever had put a death certificate on the military today, I think, woke up to the grim reality that the Myanmar military is well and alive, and whether constitutional, legally, or just by the power and matter of force, still has the ability to call the shots in that country. And it will take many, many decades for that to change. That's how I look at it in terms of the long-term game that you have to play if you really care about liberalizing these societies and these political institutions, not only in the Myanmar, by the way. We could be speaking again about Sri Lanka, about Bangladesh, about Nepal, and Pakistan, by the way, too, right? Where all these sort of constant dilemmas play out for India.
Absolutely. Not to forget, of course, the internal situation right now in India itself, which is causing a lot of worries. But just the final question, then, Constantino. I mean, there's internet connection that has been disconnected across Myanmar. Also, power shutdowns. The SOPs that normally happen in these kind of situations. Moving forward right now, when the military says that it's going to be a takeover for a year, I mean, we take it with a pinch of salt. It is perhaps going to be a longer extension than that, or there is any hope that we may actually see a curtailing of this process and in some way, perhaps a reinstatement of the government back.
So if they had announced 1 week, I would have told you 1 year. 1 year sounds certainly like more. I mean, that's natural that you get that power is sticky, that it's very difficult to be controlled. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Myanmar army would now, over the next a few days, backtrack in some way to announce a roadmap, right? That is generally in its interest. I think it's sensitive that it cannot rely too much just on Chinese support, that it's coming under pressure. And that's why the Indian statement is so important. It signals India's discontent. And that except for a few other countries, it needs to deliver more. And if it wants to diversify away from China, it will have to compromise. So I wouldn't be surprised if they come up with some type of roadmap for the time being in terms of holding elections, when these conditions are ready, etc. Again, something we've seen in many other countries. Smita, we see it in Nepal, right, where we have elections announced for May, but I think it's also quite clear that under most probable circumstances, those elections may also get delayed. So let's see what happens, but it's not that this will be a clean military takeover and indefinite. There will be a lot of concern within the army and its various factions and currents to also appease India, the Europeans, the Americans, the Southeast Asians in terms of coming out with some long-term plan.
But I mean, we've seen those reactions coming even from the United Nations. Do you expect any sort of announcements of perhaps more sanctions being slapped on them at this point in time, or something the effect being pondered about?
That's an interesting question, Smita, because exactly, I mean, if you start signaling, that is the dilemma, right? All these countries face that are on the democratic camp. And the dilemma is, how hard do you push? And if you push harder, do you really burn your bridges, right, with these countries? Because they now have an option in China that is delivering financial assistance, diplomatic support at the United Nations Security Council. Let's not forget that China is now a member of the United Nations Human Rights Council. So they have certainly a lot of support coming from China, which they didn't have that much 10, 20 years ago. At the same time, you just don't want to engage blindly, right? And that's why President Biden and the US system reacted so strongly. That's why India came out so strong. And it'll be a very difficult dilemma to see who pushes for sanctions. In fact, I'd say, Smita, this is going to be one of the most interesting tests. So one of the questions we've had over the last few weeks of how liberal, democratic, interventionist the Biden administration will be. In fact, these are questions India is worrying about still as we speak, probably. Like, how strong will the US push? Because if the US push is too strong, India will take exception, right? And if we have sanctions and further pressure on the Myanmar regime, it'll be tougher for India to play that game. Same again in Sri Lanka. You saw the statements by the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner recently coming out very strong and suggesting sanctions against Sri Lanka. There was silence from India on that. So you'll see many of these things playing out. Let's see how the US positions itself in future on these. And I think this will tell you over the next few days if we see more of a US of the 2000s, the US of the Samantha Power kind of intervention, coercion, sanctions, or if we see a US that will play more of the old Indian classical game in the neighborhood of sticks and carrots and pushing, but also giving in.
I know, and of course, New Delhi has been used to the idea of walking very difficult tightropes in the past. Too. Just one absolutely last question, Constantino. I mean, on the questions of the Rohingya refugees themselves, whatever little noise was being made about their rehabilitation or possible return, I mean, there wasn't really much hope. They've been housed in tents in Bangladesh and in other countries, and lakhs in tens of thousands. What really do you see the kind of impact of this development today on the Rohingya issue?
Well, the issue has been effectively frozen, Smita. There's no other word for it at the multilateral, international level, regional level, including with India. And I don't see it being, especially now, being unfrozen. In fact, it's even more difficult now to find any sort of long-term solution. But there are several tracks that are ongoing. The Japanese have mediating. India has offered a lot of support in terms of reconstruction of the Rakhine state. So hopefully there'll be small solutions that bring in some peace, stability, and normality towards that state, and a possible return of many of those refugees that are suffering dire circumstances in Bangladesh, and a huge cost to Bangladesh also, which obviously will be very dissatisfied about these last developments across the border with Myanmar.
Okay, too early, of course, to comment on a whole range of things right now, but India and the world will be watching those developments in Myanmar very, very closely. For now, appreciate you joining me here on this live broadcast, Constantino Xavier, and his Twitter handle is Constantino X. He's a very, very powerful voice when it comes to regional security, South Asian, Southeastern Asian, Southeast Asian security in particular. So feel free to, of course, ping him with more questions on Twitter. And for now, it's signing off from my YouTube station with this live broadcast. Thanks to all who tuned in.
Thank you.